Okay, I think we should be recording. So, greetings, everyone. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Ralph Buehler with us for this interview. Dr. Buehler is both the head of our program group called Urban Affairs, Urban Affairs group in SPIA, and is, in addition to that, a professor and, of course, in our program, and is a world expert in transportation, particularly alternative transportation systems. So, I think we're very fortunate to have him join us to talk a little bit about some of the issues we've been talking about this week around transportation and in particular alternative transportation systems. So before we get started, Ralph, do you want to say a little bit more about who you are, your background, and so on and so forth?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for spending some time with me in your class and for inviting me. Um, as Professor Schenk has introduced, my name is Ralph Buehler. I'm a professor and chair in urban affairs and planning. My expertise is in urban transportation planning and policy. This means I study how people get around cities, what determines how they get around, what determines if they drive in a car, if they ride public transport, if they ride a bike, or if they walk, and what the outcomes are of this. So what are the implications of many people driving, or many people riding a bike, many people walking, many people riding public transport. And I do that looking at US cities, Canadian cities, cities in Australia, and cities in Western Europe. Typically, I've also done some work on other places, but mainly in that geographic area. And it's a very as many topics in urban planning and policy, is a very applied area. So there's always a direct connection to people's daily lives, and there's a direct connection to mainly local policy making and decisions on how we use roadway space, how we use sidewalks, if we put in a crosswalk and things like that. So it's a very applied area of research.
Great, thank you. And I'm curious, we want to get into all those things that you've mentioned and unpack them, or many of them. Maybe to start a little bit more on, ask you a little bit more on the comparative approach you take. What are some of the benefits of that? What is it that one would hope to take away from that model or that way of approaching an issue like this?
So the comparative approach can be helpful in several ways, but I think one of the main ways is starting to look at other countries, other continents, how people are doing things elsewhere, expands the what we would as academics maybe call the universe of observations. So within the US, we have a certain range. We may go from, let's say, New York City as one very special case, all the way to, let's say, Houston. If you look at large cities in terms of the transport systems and how they and how they differ, but we don't get the transport system and the travel behavior of cities like Amsterdam, for example, in the Netherlands, or German cities, or cities in Austria, or Australian cities. So by adding these international cities, we get a different range of travel behaviors, different levels of car use, different levels of walking, cycling, transit use. And we also get different levels of other input variables. And input variables in transportation are of land use and built environment variables. That means how is land use organized? Are residences strictly separated from businesses and from industrial, or is there a mix at some grain? It's also the built environment. Do we have high density? Do we have a low density built environment? Do we have wide roadways? Do we have narrow roadways? And so by enlarging our purview and looking at international comparisons, we can gain insights about how things are done differently elsewhere, but we can also gain insights in how our system in our country or our city differs from these systems. We can start investigating what differs, why things are different, and maybe we want to change some things here at home, and we can start looking at how these other places have gotten, or why they are denser, why they have more mixed land use, why they have more bike riding, why they have more public transport. And maybe, just maybe, we can transfer then some lessons or even policy recommendations from there.
Mhm. No, that makes sense, and I think it was really interesting that you flagged that. I think many of us have this image of Western Europe, and we think about that as being wholly different than what we typically see in North American cities. But first of all, that's not always the case. We do have perhaps the exceptional, as you said, cities like New York here that do that do get into at least pretty high rates of alternative transportation use. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, New York is in many statistics actually in transportation, New York is an outlier. For example, if you look at public transport ridership in the US, something like 30 to 40% of all public transport trips in the US are taken in the New York metro area. So New
Wow.
York is really a very, very big outlier in the US. And actually, compared to Europe, New York would be an outlier. There's almost no place in Europe that has high densities as Manhattan has with the big skyscrapers and everything. So New York is sort of special or an outlier in many ways. But yet, if we look at other things like bicycling, for example, New York's bike use is very small compared to many European cities. So even though New York may be more on the European side, it's still different from all of these European cities.
Well, that's interesting, and perhaps we'll come back to that later. But the density question, I think one assumes that you need this sort of extreme density to make good alternative transportation, whether it's public transit or walking or biking, work. But many European cities, as you said, do not actually have as high of density as one might think. Is that a fair to say, or where do they rank in the sort of density scale?
I mean, New York is clearly an outlier. The European cities are on average denser than American cities. They have a higher population density. And there's a graph by two researchers called Newman and Kenworthy, and they have done some international comparative work, not just on transport, but also on land use and general energy use. And they have a graph about density, and they correlate it with energy use in that case. But they sort of find the Asian cities sort of being the densest as a geographic world group. And then you have the European cities as a next group, and they're always outliers in these. But on average, that's then sort of followed by Australian, Canadian cities, and then the U.S. cities are the lowest density in that.
Mhm.
Density matters for all sorts of modes of transport, but the importance varies. For example, for public transport, we need sort of a minimum density to make it work in a financially efficient way, which means enough people have to live within a walking distance of a public transport stop to attract enough riders. And at the same time, you have to have enough destinations, be it businesses, shops, restaurants, what have you, also around other public transport stops for people to go to. So public transport is the one mode that really needs a minimum density.
Mhm.
And if you have too low a density, you can still run public transport, or it's very hard to make it run financially viable, and also from an energy use point to make it viable. Because if you're running a bus and you only get 5 people on it, it may actually be better to have these 5 people drive in a car from an energy standpoint, because a bus is heavy, a bus uses a lot of energy to move, and if the load factor is low, that's not that great. For walking, density matters, but also the mix of use. So walking is a mode of transport that's used for, let's say, trips shorter than 2 miles. Typically, people can also walk longer, but you have to have origins and destinations. That's how we call it in transport research. So places where our trip starts and places where we go within half a mile, up to 2 miles. And if the distance gets too far, most people will not choose to walk. So density and mix of use matters there. Bicycling is interesting because bicycling is somewhere in between. It needs trip distances that are doable, but 5 miles is no problem on a bicycle. So the densities don't have to be that high, and the mix doesn't have to be that as great as for walking. If you think about it, bicycling also has quite some similarities to driving, because you're fairly fast, or faster than walking, and your route choice is sort of almost unlimited. You can make a turn at this corner, turn the next corner, and come back to your route. Quite
Mhm.
different from public transport. So what you say is correct. Densities matter, but they matter in different ways for different modes of transport.
Great. No, and that's helpful. And I guess staying on this subject of both variety in density, variety in mode choices, and recognizing that if we should come back to goals by way in a moment here, but if our goal is higher usage of alternative transport writ large, whether that's walking, biking, public transit, that mix looks very different. Could you describe a couple of examples of, I mean, I think you covered density quite nicely there, but if we think about cities that are outliers in terms of cycling, or cities that are outliers in terms of walking, or cities that are outliers in public transit, what would be some examples?
So public transport oriented cities are, for example, parts of New York City, not all of New York City though. Once you get into the outer boroughs, towards the end of the lines, it's much harder to get around by public transport. Maybe looking at just countries I studied, so leaving out the Asian countries, would be Zurich, Switzerland is a great public transport city.
Mhm.
Um, One indicator we use to compare transport usage internationally is public transport trips per person per year. And in Zurich, people take more than one public transport trip on average per day. So every person takes more than one public transport trip on average in Zurich. Compared to the US average, it's 20 trips a year. So the Zurich has over 365. So that's a lot. It's a very public transport oriented city, has a very fine grained public transport systems. So they have a regional rail that runs through the city. They have intercity rail, but then within the city, they have a trolley or a light rail system that distributes trips within the neighborhoods, and they have a very good bus system on top of that. And so it's very easy to get around on public transport in Zurich. And because they have such a big system and so many trains and buses, the wait times are relatively low. And so if you have a low wait time, what that means is, and they're as low that you can almost walk up to a bus stop or a transit stop, and you can be sure that within 10 minutes a train will come. And from a public transport perspective, that's sort of what you want. You don't want people to use a timetable. The best timetable is no timetable, because you know a public transport trip is going to come. And by the way, that's one of the key factors why people don't ride public transport is long wait times.
Mhm.
People don't like to wait. Uh, they don't like to wait when they transfer. So and that's also important for the Zurich case. If you have many trains coming, you may get on a bus that will only get you halfway there. You get off, and right there is the connection. You can get on a trolley or a light rail that will get you to your destination. So Zurich would be a transit-oriented city. Ironically, by the way, Los Angeles used to be a very public transport and trolley-oriented city. It was built originally around many public transport lines that are by now all gone, and of course a lot of suburban sprawl
Mhm.
has taken over. But the history of LA is actually quite interesting, and it was a city that was built around public transport many years ago. In terms of a bicycling oriented city, um, among large cities, Copenhagen in Denmark and Amsterdam in the Netherlands come to mind. Copenhagen is also one of the bike cities in Denmark. Amsterdam is not in the Netherlands. Actually, when
Mhm.
you talk to Dutch people, they will say, "Yeah, Amsterdam is not that great." You have to
Mhm.
go to smaller towns in the Netherlands where biking is even more popular. What those cities do typically, and that's a big factor to get people to ride bikes, is they provide safe uh, conditions for cycling. So safety is a big deterrent for people to ride a bike. There have been surveys done here in the US that find that about 50 to 60% of the population says we would consider riding a bike, but it's too dangerous. I'm not going to get on a bike. So providing safe conditions is very important. That's what these cities do. They do it slightly differently, but in general, along roadways with fast moving car traffic, so let's say faster than 30 miles per hour, they provide separate bikeway infrastructure. This can be bike lanes, which is just a stripe of paint on the road that gives cyclists some space, or buffered bike lanes. This is a stripe of paint, but then some additional space with bollards or something, giving cyclists even more space, more separation from the traffic they're so afraid of.
Mhm.
And then what Copenhagen does really well are so-called cycle tracks, which are curb separated. So you have a normal curb as you would have towards the walkway of the pedestrians, the sidewalk, but on the side of the street, you have another curb that separates the bikeway from the roadway. So you have the road, a curb up, and there are the bikes, another curb up, there are the pedestrians. And these cycle tracks are really popular with cyclists to get them to ride. On top of that, they have reduced the traffic speeds throughout their cities, and especially in neighborhoods, down to often 20 miles per hour, or especially in the Netherlands, often to walking speed. So in residential areas, when you're a driver, you can really only drive very, very slowly to get to your house, because there are bicyclists, pedestrians, and children. And that sort of gets us to the other mode you asked about. That's the walking-oriented cities. Um, and often walking-oriented cities and transit-oriented cities go together,
Mhm.
because the main access mode to get to public transport and the main egress mode to get away from public transport is by walking. So
Mhm.
in the US, we often call this the first last mile
Mhm.
issue. It doesn't have to be a mile, but it's the first and last trip. And many of the cities that are, and many British cities have done a good job at being very pedestrian friendly, um, is providing safe conditions for pedestrians. And safe conditions for pedestrians are similar to those for cyclists. They are a separation from car traffic when it's moving fast and when there is a lot of it. It's providing low car travel speeds in neighborhoods and areas for people to walk. What you see behind me is a pedestrian-friendly environment that's in the German city of Freiburg, and many European cities have done that. They have banned cars from entering often the city center or a neighborhood center, and they call them pedestrian zones. So the pedestrians have the right of way across the entire area. Of course, there are some exceptions. For example, if police have to go after someone, police will be able to come in. If you have a disability that doesn't allow you to enter the area, you're allowed to drive there, but very slowly. These areas allow for deliveries, typically in the morning and in the evenings at the off hours for pedestrians. Delivery trucks can come in there. But it's an area that's sort of giving pedestrians a space to use the entire width of what used to be sort of the roadway that's taken over by the car. Another element of that, though, is providing ample crosswalks across streets with higher traffic volume and signal activated crosswalks. Very typical here in the US to only have a crosswalk at the end of a block. And especially if you get into suburban areas, the block can be really long. So you often see, and I'm not endorsing that, but you see unsafe behavior by pedestrians in the suburbs. They're running across 4-lane highways to get to the other side because there may be a bus stop or there may be a grocery store, whatever is there. And that behavior shouldn't happen, but it happens because the next crosswalk or the next safe crossing may be half a mile away. So you would walk half a mile, cross there safely, walk half a mile back, and then go to the grocery store that you see right across the street from where you live. So providing an environment that when you plan, also thinks about these last mile or these pedestrian connections is very important in the cities. And overall, as a last point, for pedestrians and cyclists, taking out lowering the car travel speed is very crucial to increase safety, but we can talk about that later, maybe a little bit.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's great. And that there's a lot to certainly unpack there. Maybe as a way to start unpacking it further would be to start to enumerate what are the goals with a sustainable transportation system. I mean, you've certainly already highlighted many of them, but just to make sure we have them explicitly on the table, what would be the goals? I mean, you said safety is clearly going to be one.
So
What are the other goals we have?
So there are many indicators for sustainability. Typically, when we talk in transport about sustainability, we sort of take this traditional definition of this three-legged stool or this Venn diagram that overlaps with three different areas, and so that includes the economy, the environment, and equity or social equity. And it's actually very hard to find policies where all of these three areas overlap. So you can very easily think about goals like reducing environmental pollution. So you're maximizing the environment area of this three-legged stool, but it may not be equitable, or it may not be good for the economy. Or you could think about something that maximizes the economy, but we're forgetting about the environment and equity. Vice versa, you can have a policy that may be equitable. It could be equitable, for example, to say the government should get everybody a car.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody could drive around. That would be equitable policy, but it would not be that good for the environment, for example. Um, so within that, we talk about sustainability, and there are different indicators that are used for sustainable transport systems. One is looking at, and especially these days with global climate change, looking at energy use and at global emissions. This would be CO2 emissions. Transportation is one of the sectors that's still uniquely dependent on petroleum.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's all this talk about electric cars and this and that, but I just looked at the numbers the other day. In the US, only 4% of all newly sold cars are electric.
Wow.
So there's a long way to go before we all have electric cars in the vehicle fleet. The average car is 11 or 12 years old. So even if we now sold 100% electric cars, it would at least take 11 to 12 years to get to all electric cars. So energy use is one of these indicators. Another indicator is accessibility. And accessibility means allowing people or providing a transport systems that allows people to get places they need to go. Typically, and there's a very strong social equity component in that, allowing people to get to work. So having access to a workplace, and very often in transport systems, for example, in U.S. cities that are very car oriented, those who don't have a car or don't own a car have a hard time getting to work because public transport may not go to where they need to go, may not go at the time they need to go, or may just not be convenient. In particular, we have often um, individuals in jobs with lower incomes, like service workers. They have to go to places against the main commute time. So let's say public transport is oriented to get people in the morning into the central business district downtown and in the evening out. Somebody who's cleaning offices has a schedule that they need to go downtown in the evening and they have to come out in the middle of the night, but they may not own a car. And the public transport system often is oriented in a way that it gets people in the morning and out in the evening, but it's very hard to commute against the stream or in the off peak time. So accessibility is another big indicator. And it's not just jobs, it's also access to food, for example. Can you get to a supermarket that has a grocery store that has healthy food, or are you limited to your local, using a corner store or bodega as a New York term that may not have the food you need? Another indicator often used these days is safety, traffic safety, and that looks at traffic crashes, at injuries, severe injuries, and fatalities from it. You may have heard about a concept called Vision Zero. So many cities, towns, also the federal government have started talking about Vision Zero. And the idea is to reduce the number of fatalities and injuries in traffic. And the numbers are quite staggering in that. So in the US, 35,000 people a year are killed in traffic. That's a big number. Globally, 1.2 million people die in traffic every year. That's 1.2 million worldwide that are killed in traffic. These are big numbers, and that's not even the severe injuries of people who may live with a disability or who may get better. That's only the tip of the iceberg. Is that so? Traffic safety is also a big goal for sustainability. Of course, financial efficiency of the transport system can be a goal. So if we have only a limited pot of money, how do we use that pot of money in the best way to get the best outcome in terms of maybe accessibility, getting people to places? There are many more of these indicators within sustainability. Um, two more, and then I'll finish with this. One is very hard to measure, what we call livability.
Yeah.
So livability is how much people can enjoy a place, how safe it is in terms of also not just traffic safety, but also general safety and security, how enjoyable it is. For example, the place behind me would be a very livable place, a place where people can relax and can be outside and enjoy themselves. So livability is a concept we try to measure quite a bit, and it's very hard because also livability means different things
Mm-hmm.
for different people. So maybe that's enough as example. So sustainability can be measured in many different ways.
That's great. Thank you. And I appreciate the challenge of how do we concurrently meet various objectives here. Although I would wonder, and again, this is a normative and a relative perspective, but that there are some places that seem to check more of these boxes than others, right? That there are places. Are there places that you look at where you say they work? If we look against a lot of these different indicators, maybe not all of them, but many of them can say it works.
I mean, there are many places that work, but I think most places have to get better and can still improve. So sustainability is not, at least I think of sustainability not as an end state,
Mm-hmm,
but it's more a process of getting more sustainable. So I wouldn't say there is the sustainable place, because everything we do is in some way um, unsustainable,
mm-hmm,
or is in some way impacting the environment or equity. So there are places that do better, and there
mm-hmm,
are places that are doing worse. Um, but there's always still room for improvement or for doing more. And in fact, many of the places that, from a transport perspective, are quite sustainable, we talked about Amsterdam before, or Copenhagen, they're doing more. They're building more of these bike lanes and more of these pedestrian zones. They're trying to really get to vision zero. They try to get down to zero traffic fatalities a year, and they're trying to change their systems. Some cities, also some countries now, um, are really pushing to get gasoline-powered cars out of their city centers by a certain year. Like the city of Oslo in Norway was one of the first ones to have a goal like that.
mm-hmm,
So even though these cities work right now, they're still quite um, automobile dependent, as most of Western society is. Cars still largely use petroleum, which has all sorts of environmental aspects. So while these places may be more sustainable than some US cities, they still have a way to go, and they're still not at zero for the traffic fatalities. They're not at zero for the emissions. They're not at 100% for accessibility for everyone. So it's a process, and places like Zurich, Amsterdam, or Copenhagen are more sustainable, but they are not a sustainable nirvana where everything works and everything is perfect.
No, and they're also expensive places, right? So far as I appreciate this, the sustainability, and that's the way we frame it in this class, is sustainability as this more holistic. You say traditional, but it's funny. It's as old as that concept is, I'm not sure it's really sunk in our way of thinking fully of that. It's not just about environment; it's about also social concerns and so on. And so,
No, also because the sustainability discussion has, and I'm not against it, but has very much focused on the environment,
mhm, yeah.
or has sort of been pulled in the environmental direction. And if you look at the Venn diagrams, this environment is it's important, but it's one of the circles.
Mhm.
And you shouldn't forget about the other circles and then find these overlapping areas. So there's still a long way to go to be truly sustainable.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so now that we have a list of kind of goals, and now to contradict ourselves as well, because we said how they're all holistically integrated. If we think about them, I was going to say one by one, but maybe some of these the ways to advance them actually address more than one, and those are the optimal ones. But I'm curious about policy interventions. I mean, truth be told, as much as you're understandably reticent to say there are these utopias out there, because they're always a work in progress, there are places that are fundamentally at different spots on the spectrum in many of these metrics, right? If we look at safety, it's just a reality. Then this goes to one of your more recent papers that for cycling and pedestrian safety in many Western European cities is just not even comparable to North American cities. Is that a fair sort of unfair in the sense that it's pretty brief, but sort of fair one-liner on what you find?
Yes, and that's also helps explain why fewer people walk and cycle here in the US. So we did a recent paper looking at traffic safety for pedestrians and cyclists between 1990 and about 2018. And we looked at the US and four Western European countries, the UK, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. And what we found is much higher fatality rates for the US, so much greater likelihood as a pedestrian or cyclist to get killed in traffic here. And we're talking about 4 or 5 times greater likelihood of getting killed in traffic per trip or per mile walked or per mile cycled, so substantial safety gap. And then what we found, and it's even more troubling, is when we look at the trends over time. in these rates, we see that the European countries have made much more progress than the US between 1990 and 2010. So they have reduced their risk much more. So again, much safer per trip or per kilometer walked or cycled in those countries than in the US. The US has also improved, but not as much. And then the most troubling point now is since 2010 about the safety in the US for pedestrians and cyclists has gone the opposite way and has gotten much, much more dangerous. In fact, we have had increases in pedestrian fatalities in the US now that were only comparable to the 1950s or 60s when we had rampant automobile ownership increase and no thought of pedestrians and cyclists at the time. It's a very troubling trend in the US. So it's not only the US is worse than the European countries in safety, but the gap between them has been widening over the last 20, 30 years and is widening at an even faster rate at the moment. And so these European countries, they still have a way to go. They're not at zero, but they have implemented policies that have made walking and cycling safer over the last 20, 30, 40 years. And they include measures we already talked about, a pedestrian zone, like we see behind me, for example. You're very unlikely to get hit and killed by a car in a zone like that. This is very simple. But what we have here is no cars, or if cars come in, they're very slow. Other examples are in neighborhoods, and many European cities, not all, have traffic comped their neighborhoods to 20 miles per hour or even slower. And what that does for traffic safety is that you have fewer crashes because if you're driving more slowly, you have a much longer reaction time. Once you see someone, you can brake and you can avoid a crash. If a crash happens, that crash will be less severe because the impact is less severe. In fact, research shows that at about 20 miles per hour, the likelihood for a pedestrian that's hit by a car to get killed starts going up exponentially. So that's a good speed, lower than that, to set in neighborhoods. So speed is one of the key elements in that. We speculate that there are some other factors that help explain this increase in the US that we see now, and that has to do not only with speed, but also with larger vehicles. The share of light trucks, so pickup trucks and SUVs and minivans in newly sold cars in the US is about 2/3. So about 2/3 of all vehicles sold for passengers are light trucks, SUVs, and minivans. So these big vehicles, and they have gotten bigger over the years. So a pickup truck now looks humongous compared to a pickup truck of the 80s. And what that does is for a pedestrian is because they are very blunt, they've gotten taller. So if you're getting hit by a pickup truck, you're getting hit around your torso or your belly, where many important organs are. If you're hit by a passenger car that's lower, you're likely hit around your legs, and you're falling on the vehicle, and your likelihood to survive that crash is much greater. So these larger, heavier vehicles are part of what helps likely explain the increased death rates we see in the US. Another one is distraction. So we've all have cell phones now with texting and smartphones with internet and all sorts of chats and things, and many people are using them while driving. And in the US, enforcement is not very good around that. In fact, in many states, the police cannot pull you over if you are texting or if you're on the phone, because it's a so-called second order offense, which means they could pull you over for something else that's wrong with your car. That's a first order offense. And then they could fine you as well for texting or for being on the phone. But even if you drive by a police in those states, you cannot be pulled over for that because it's a second order offense. Even if the state wanted to or the police wanted to, they couldn't enforce it. Another element is that many states in the US don't allow red light cameras at intersections. So if you're running a red light, many or most European cities have some intersections with cameras in them. And what it does is it takes a picture, it reads your number plate, and you get a bill in the mail, or they may take your driver license away depending on how you cross that intersection. And the same is true for speed cameras. Many European countries have put up speed cameras along roadways, and if you go above the speed limit, it takes a picture. There's no police, nobody involved, and it sends you a bill to the holder of the car. In the US, again, many states don't allow red light cameras, and they don't allow speed cameras. The privacy concerns are cited for that, but it really hampers enforcement of traffic speeds, because research shows that if you can be fined at an intersection for running a red light, people are less likely to run a red light. If
Mhm.
there's a speed camera along the road, people, at least where the speed camera is, they drive more slowly. So that's another reason. And then the last reason I want to talk about very briefly for the safety is the roadway design. So many roadways in the US are built to and have been built to move automobiles. And what motorists need is a long, clear vista to see straight ahead, wide lanes and wide roads to go fast. And that has been sort of the main planning idea for many, many decades in the US. And these environments are really dangerous for
Mhm.
pedestrians and for cyclists, because of the speed, but also because of they're not friendly to pedestrians. And one example is when pedestrians want to cross a roadway, let's say at an intersection, um, to increase visibility of pedestrians, many European countries have built so-called bulb outs. So at that intersection, the sidewalk widens and carries the pedestrian beyond the parked cars, still on the sidewalk, so that you as a driver can see the pedestrian and the pedestrian can see you. And if you do that on both sides of a corner of an intersection, you are sort of changing the turning radius of the car making that turn. If you're keeping the pedestrians back on the sidewalk side, and you allow the car a fast turn by not changing the radius, the car will go around that bend very quickly. If the
Mhm.
car goes around that bend fast, the likelihood A, they see you is lower, and B, that if they hit you at a higher speed. And on top of that, if you provide these bulb outs on both sides of the intersection, you're um, changing the crossing distance for the pedestrian. So the pedestrian is actually shorter on the road because they are not crossing the parking lanes on either side. So you're shortening the impact zone for pedestrians. Other examples include that most European countries require median islands in a
Mhm.
roadway for a pedestrian to cross if you have multiple lanes. In the US, we often have crosswalks or things across 4-lane roadways. And they're very dangerous because of what we call a double threat. And that is, um, let's say you're crossing one of these roadways, you have 2 lanes coming from your left-hand side, and the lane immediately next to you is a pedestrian, the car stops, or these days, because they are big, an SUV or a pickup truck stops. And now you are hidden. You're in the road, you're hidden in sight from the driver coming on the other lane because you're walking behind that pickup truck. So you're assuming the pickup truck has stopped, all is clear to cross. A car is approaching from behind that cannot see you, and you're stepping out of the view shed of that pickup truck and you get hit by the car. And there's no median island or no other precaution to protect you as a pedestrian. In Germany, for example, crosswalks across roadways with more than 2 lanes are forbidden.
Mhm.
You cannot do it. You have to do a signalized intersection or pedestrian activated signal because they're deemed too dangerous. So in short, we can do a lot in design to make our roadways safer. And the safety is in a sense, it's passive, but the design forces the driver to be slower or to not make a mistake. So very often we hear in the news media, the driver lost control or the driver didn't observe or something. But very often that mistake made by the driver could have been avoided with smart engineering and smart design. So
Mhm.
you rarely hear and say, well, you may hear the driver went around the curve too fast and hit a pedestrian. But you rarely hear and say the engineer did not design that intersection properly, and that's why a pedestrian died. But in fact, that's what we have to start thinking about. Sort of, how do we build these roadway systems? How do drivers interact with them? How do pedestrians interact? And how can we build these systems to make them safer?
Mhm. That's great. Wow, thank you. I mean, that's such a comprehensive overview. And I appreciate the two kind of high level takeaways. The one being that there are this is policy, it is design, and that's this is an environmental policy and planning class, and policies matter. And on the other hand, they, because their policies, they're political, and they're choices we make, and sometimes they're going to be popular with some people and unpopular with others, and therefore they need to be justified, they need to be advocated for. But I think very quickly, just to give a couple examples to build off exact things you said. One would be the smartphone effect, and it always shocks me to see people just clearly not paying attention going down the road. Whenever we're in Canada, my parents, one of the first things they say every time we seem to get in the car is, "Don't forget not to touch your phone," because in Ontario is a minimum $500 fine for touching your phone, not for sort of being engrossed in doing a text message. You can't even hold it to your ear when you're driving. If they see a phone in your hand, it's a first order offense. They can pull you over for it, and it's minimum $500. And that's a lot of money, even in Canadian dollars. So, they always say that it seems to work. On the flip side, in terms of policies that the challenges of keeping policies even when they're effective. I remember when I was younger, we had photo radar in Ontario, which are talking about the sort of what we call photo radar, the speed cameras along the road, without police. And it was so unpopular that, of course, the next time there was an election, a competing party ran party in their platform on getting rid of these damn photo radars that were, taking pictures of people and sending you bills, and got elected and took them out. So, so it's because these are policies, they can come and go, but they also do make change. And we often think of European cities as just, well, they've always been that way. And that's not true, right? I mean, the ratio of pedestrian and cycling, as far as I understand it, for example, in the Netherlands, has grown exponentially since the
Mhm.
1970s, right? When they started really paying attention to this. Is that fair to say, that we assume that it's always been that way, and it's really not the case, right? It's investment.
It has not always been the way. One point before I talk about this, to go back with the cell phone or the smartphone, looking at it, there's fantastic research out there looking at how long it takes your eyes to readjust to the roadway when you look up from down here. So when you look up, while you're looking up physically, you're not actually seeing everything because your eyes need to readjust, A, to the speed, and B, to the outlook that is very different from the short distance you're looking on your phone. So there's real danger in that, even though if we think we have it under control, we don't. Now to the policy changes over time, and that's very important. So in many European countries after the Second World War, we had a similar trend as here in the US. So the car was the mode of the future, and all of these things, especially the trolleys, were in the way of that. And many European cities tore out their trolley lines, like the US, and car ownership and car use were sort of skyrocketing at the time, as were traffic fatalities and local air pollution and traffic congestion and things. And many countries, not all, in the 70s started swinging back or started changing their policies. We have a fascinating a graph about the Netherlands in one of our publications where we see a steep decline in bicycling until about the mid 1970s in the Netherlands, starting 1950. And at the same time, the cyclist fatalities are skyrocketing, and they're hitting right at the time when cycling is at its lowest. The fatalities are hitting the high point. And what started happening then there in the mid 70s is people got upset with the fatalities and the loss of quality of life, and they started lobbying for lower car travel speeds in cities. A big slogan at the time was "Stop the children's murder," because so many kids got run down by cars in cities, kids playing in the street or close to the street. And they started changing their policies. They started promoting bicycling, promoting walking, reducing car travel speeds, reducing car parking, reducing car volumes in neighborhoods and along these streets. And what you got in return then was an increase again, especially in the Netherlands in bicycling. Since then. So it really shows that the policies you pursue, especially also on the local level, have a clear impact on how people will get around and how they can get around. The most easy thing to see is if you have a trolley line and you tear it out, nobody will ride that trolley. It's very as simple as that. But it's the same if you don't build bikeways. People will not ride a bike. If you don't build bike parking where people can park their bikes, they will not be able to park their bikes, and it will be less attractive. If, on the other hand, you tear down buildings and build big parking lots and make parking free in the inner city, it's convenient and people will drive there. So the policy, and also especially the local policy at the city level, can have a big impact on how people get around, can get around your town. And so many European cities went the American way,
after Second World War, and then started turning around somewhere between the mid 70s, and for some it took until the early 90s, but then they started promoting again bicycling, transit, and walking. And
Mhm.
we also see that trend in some US cities.
Yeah. Great. Okay, I realize I'm watching the time, and unfortunately, this has been such a great conversation. But I know we're gonna have to wrap up pretty soon. I feel like you've done great coverage of safety. I feel like the accessibility has been pretty well embedded, maybe not as explicitly, but throughout. The last thing I'd love to ask you about, though, is environmental factors. And again, we've already talked about some. You mentioned already, for example, low or zero emissions vehicles in cars, and sorry, in city centers. I'm curious about other policies, though, particularly because I feel like those are the ones that are more foreign to here, right?
Mhm.
We don't even see really great examples of that.
So, I mean, transport has many environmental impacts. One is, and we talked about that a little bit already, are the very emissions of the car. So you have global emissions with the CO2 emissions, but you also have local emissions
Mhm.
with particulate matter, for example, and other emissions that come out locally and are detrimental very immediately to the local population. Europe has actually had sort of a strange approach to that because a lot of the European countries had focused on diesel engines
Mhm.
in their vehicles. Diesel is more efficient. So you use less diesel per mile traveled than you use gasoline, but at the same time there are higher particulate matter emissions with that. And you may have heard about the emissions scandal around mainly German automobile manufacturers who were sort of cheating and telling people that the cars are cleaner than they really were. Um, so that's a big concern. The concentration of local air pollutants, and some European cities have created zones in their inner cities or downtowns where only vehicles with a certain emissions category can drive. So if you have a vehicle that's above the emissions category set for that area, your vehicle can just not drive in that area. So you need a vehicle that's at least in its color coded in Europe at the moment. So you need a green decal on your car based on the local air pollutants that come out of your tailpipe to enter certain areas. Or you need a yellow or a red decal. And if you don't have that, you're not allowed to drive in the downtown. Some cities use that permanently. Others use it based on the air quality. So they may allow you to drive on a good air quality day in your more polluting car. But if the air quality gets worse, they will say, okay, no cars in category X, Y, and Z will be allowed in there. And another element is, of course, the fuel usage for the cars. So there is a push towards either smaller cars or cars, because they're more fuel efficient, or cars that have zero emissions. And you can also incentivize that by having special parking lots or special areas where only zero emission vehicles can access. Um, Other elements of transport in terms of the environment is the sealing of surfaces, which has to do then with heat island effects in cities, and it has to do with water runoff. So if you have heavy rains and you have sealed off a big part of your city, the water has nowhere to go. It will run over the pavement and will then go into the sewer, and they may back up because the systems get overwhelmed. So there has been an effort. For example, behind me, the city of Freiburg, you see, maybe if you go the other way, there's a trolley coming through that pedestrian zone behind me. Um, Outside of the city center, many of the trolleys are running in grassy beds. So you have the rails, and around you have grass, which has two effects. One is it makes the trolley not as loud if it's running on grass, and it also gives green space where water can go and can be stored when it rains. So that's another effect of transport. And many cities try to make areas greener or have less asphalt, especially in from parking lots or other things.
Great. Well, thank you. And that's fantastic to have this, in-depth overview of, some of these important policies and the impacts they've had. And shameless self-promotion, of course, we'll be doing the study abroad again, hopefully, fingers crossed, some year,
Yes.
hopefully this year, but some year, if not this year. And we'll look at many of these things, of course, in three dimensions. through that program and see some of the implications and what they look like in practice. Um, okay, well, if any final thoughts as we part ways here?
Um, Final thoughts is transportation is a fascinating area of research because of what I said at the beginning of its practical implication for everyday life, but also because of all these connections to sustainability. And so it's a very interesting field to study. Maybe a last point we didn't get to talk about very much today, but there's a big connection also between the transport system and public health.
Mhm.
So if you walk more, if you ride your bike more for daily trip purposes to go to the store, to go to work, you are including physical activity into your daily routine. And physical activity, just in a nutshell, is good for your physical health and for your mental health. In
Mhm.
fact, there was a study in Denmark that found that for kids, primary school kids, cycling to school was very important for their ability to learn, to
Mhm.
sit still and absorb things. And they had a very interesting regression model where they put in having breakfast and cycling to school. And cycling to school was actually more important for the learning of the kids than having breakfast, which I couldn't believe. But the point is, how you get around also has public health implications. That's another area we could explore in the future. So, and last point, um, transportation has also been very stubborn in the US in terms of increasing its sustainability. It's one of the sectors that's really largely still petroleum dependent and has not really been able to reduce its CO2 emissions and petroleum dependency. So it's an area that needs your research and needs your work to drive down these CO2 emissions and increase the sustainability.
Mm. No, that's great. Thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that the health factor because it is so important. But also the last point you made is so important around, one could look at this and say, well, this isn't an exciting area. The US is kind of ossified in it. Or you could look at the opposite way and say, no, there's just so much opportunity. This is such an area of such import to our lives, and there's so much possibility. And we've focused more, whether implicitly or explicitly, on kind of cities in this. There's so much possibility to think about how this is operationalized in the realities of where many Americans live, which is a more suburban type landscape. And it's not impossible, right? Some of the things we talked about may be harder, but many of them can work, right? And we see things like infill in many cities now, certainly in Northern Virginia, many cities focusing on infill development, right, as one way to try to at least increase density, to make transportation systems more viable. But there's possibility, right? It's not a
Yeah,
wall.
or with the infill, also have more mix.
Yeah.
So at the moment, the suburbs may not have a center where you can go to for restaurants or for jobs or for shopping, and so filling in these areas with centers like
Mm.
a old fashioned village that had a village center. You can provide destinations for not all trips. You still have to drive for quite a few trips, but for some trips to do on bike or on foot.
Mhm. Exactly. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Buehler. This has been really informative, and I'm sure the students will find this a great video. So I'll stop the recording.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.